Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome once again to the House of Kosova. It is a privilege to open this distinguished panel, which brings together some of the brightest minds in the field of AI from 5 different continents. As the final panel hosted by the House of Kosova this year, it is no surprise that we're closing with a topic as profoundly relevant as artificial intelligence, which is also the main theme of this year's World Economic Forum. I would like to extend a special thanks to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, Professor Irene Tracy, and to Director of Oxford's world-renowned Institute for Ethics in AI, Professor John Tasoulias, for agreeing to be our official co-organizers of this event. This is our first official collaboration with Oxford University. I hope and expect that it will not be the last. The theme of tonight's panel is artificial intelligence in a democratic society. And there is no better place than the House of Kosovo to discuss this topic. Despite being one of the world's youngest states, Kosovo has quickly become the strongest and most robust democracy in the region. Our country's advancement on a range of democratic measures has been confirmed by multiple international organizations over the past few years. For example, during our government's mandate, we've improved 21 places in Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. We've come out first in the Western Balkans and among the top 9 countries in the world in terms of democratic progress, according to VDEM Institute's Electoral Democracy Index. Gallup's ranking last year on law and order lists Kosovo as the first in the Western Balkans, second in Europe, and 5th in the world. And similarly, we are the first in the Western Balkans, second in Europe, and 3rd in the world for improvement in civil liberties and political rights, according to Freedom House 2023 report. For Kosovo, the promotion of democratic values is not simply one government priority among others. It is also a source of national pride and an essential part of our identity as a state and as people. As a young and dynamic democracy, we have embraced technology as a cornerstone of our development. We are investing in digital infrastructure, education, and innovation to ensure that progress is both inclusive and doesn't leave anyone behind. In the last few years, we have made significant progress in our digital transformation journey. Last year, Kosovo achieved full broadband connectivity for all its villages, making it a leader not only in the region but also across Europe in laying the foundations for inclusive growth. The rollout of 5G is well underway, with 65% coverage within the country already achieved. Meanwhile, our innovation hubs, such as the 40-hectare Innovation and Training Park in Prizren and the Tech Park in Pristina, are becoming incubators of creativity and entrepreneurship. But transformation is not just about infrastructure, it is about people. We have awarded nearly 5,000 STEM, science, technology, engineering, math scholarships, focusing on empowering women and young people to lead the next wave of innovation. And an additional 5,000 individuals have been trained in various ICT fields through government programs supported by our development partners. On top of all of this, progress over the past few years, incorporating and developing AI technologies in our state and society is the next logical step. Kosovo is committed to a future where technology serves humanity. AI must remain a tool for empowerment, not control. We must govern it with transparency, fairness, and accountability. As we explore the possibilities of AI, we must ask ourselves, how can we ensure that its benefits are shared equitably, and how can we protect human dignity, rights, and freedoms in the age of intelligence? The answer largely lies in partnership. The challenge of AI cannot be solved by governments alone. They require collaboration with the private sector, academia, and civil society Together we can help design AI systems that reflect our values, prioritize inclusion, and enhance the richness of human culture. Kosova's story is one of resilience, determination, and progress. We are proud to rank as leaders in IT competitiveness in the Western Balkans and emerging Europe. But more than rankings, we are driven by the belief that technology must uphold the principles of democracy, equality, and justice. Ladies and gentlemen, the age of intelligence brings both promise and responsibility. We must work together to ensure that AI remains a catalyst for ethical innovation, sustainable growth, and better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great honor and a privilege for us to be here in the House of Kosovo, engaging with you as co-organizers of this activity. My name is John Tasulis. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford. The Institute was created in 2020 because of a feeling that artificial intelligence was going to be a transformative technology. It was going to cause great changes in the way that we live, and that it was very important that the humanities, in particular philosophy, have a voice in steering how these changes would take place. And we've been trying to develop over time a humanistic approach to artificial intelligence, which, as the Prime Minister indicated, is all about using AI as a tool that enables the better fulfillment of human beings and their flourishing, rather than systematically replacing human beings. Now, in this panel, we're going to discuss some profound challenges and opportunities arising from the interaction of two technologies. The first technology is artificial intelligence, which broadly relates to the use of computer-based algorithms to do things like composing a poem or diagnosing an illness, that normally require intelligence when they are done by human beings. AI is a technology that is only really decades old, and in recent years has experienced a massive revolution in terms of its capabilities, with the emergence of powerful new machine learning algorithms, and also combined with massive increases in digital data and in computing power. The other technology we're interested in is democracy itself, because democracy is a technique of political decision-making. And that goes back, of course, to 5th century BC Athens and beyond. So why have we chosen democracy as a lens from which to assess artificial intelligence? The answer is because of the great value of democratic government. And this value, which we're too tempted to forget these days, can be articulated at two levels. The first level at which democracy is valuable is that it's a decision-making process that delivers the goods of governance. So think about the great economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. There has never been a famine in a democracy. Why? Because famines are not due to shortage of food. Famines arise because of lack of information about where food is needed and lack of accountability in giving the food to the places where it's needed. And democracy ensures both the circulation of information and the relevant accountability. Or think about the Harvard human rights scholar Catherine Sinkink in her empirical investigation of how do we best ensure that human rights are complied with. And her answer is the single most important factor in ensuring compliance with human rights is having a democratic government. Contrast those who think there's a tension between democracy and human rights. Or think about peace, obviously an important value, especially today. Back in the 18th century, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant developed the democratic peace hypothesis, that democracies tend not to go to war against each other. And finally, think about the benefits of technological innovation itself. It's tempting to think that technological innovation automatically generates prosperity that is equitably shared and benefits all. But as Acemoglu and Johnson, recent Nobel Prize winners in economics, show in their book Power and Progress, technological innovation by itself doesn't generate widely shared goods unless it is subject to robust democratic control. So democracies deliver the goods of government in these and many other ways. And part of the reason they can do so is a point related to intelligence, because democracies can draw on the diverse knowledge and intelligence of different citizens. Or as Aristotle put it, sometimes the person who lives in a house knows more about the house than the architect who designed it. Democracy enables us to bring in the knowledge of different people, no matter how humble their status may appear to be. But in addition to delivering the goods, these other goods, prosperity, peace, human rights, democracy has value in itself. It's not just an instrument for delivering goods. And that's because there is something, or many of us believe there is something, intrinsically valuable in free and equal citizens deliberating and deciding together about the shape of the common life that they will have. And this sort of collective self-government, where everyone has a voice as free and equal, my co-author Josiah Ober, one of the leading writers on democracy, calls life with no boss. And there is something very attractive in the idea of life with no boss, and that is what democracy articulates over and above the extra goods it delivers. Democracy in this way pays tribute to the fact that we are autonomous, rational beings, and we deserve a say in the decisions that affect us. And yet, for all these benefits, today democracy is in crisis. Many people, especially young people in established democracies, no longer believe that living in a democratic society is essential. And we see other factors in play, like massive reductions in party membership. Meanwhile, we see the spectacular rise of China, which represents a powerful authoritarian model for achieving the goods of government, notably technological advance and widespread prosperity, but without democracy. Now, the question for this panel is how will and how should the new technology of AI interact with the venerable technology of democratic government? One possibility is that AI will exacerbate our democratic malaise. For example, maybe the algorithms of social media will create misinformation, disinformation. They'll stoke political polarization that undermines genuine democratic deliberation. Maybe as AI takes over increasing numbers of jobs, economic disparities will be magnified, creating massive instability. Maybe the emergence, if it happens, of super-intelligent AI will provoke a spiritual crisis in human beings. The thing that gave us our special dignity, our rational capacities, we suddenly find there's another sort of being that is superior to us in rational capacity. And maybe we'll lose confidence in ourselves, including in our confidence to govern ourselves. And finally, maybe the drastic threats that some people see in AI, the threat that AI may even wipe out humanity, this existential threat, maybe that will lead governments to become even more authoritarian and to curb people's civil rights in the name of protecting them from this dangerous technology. And these are just a few of the AI-fueled anti-democratic scenarios. On the other hand, perhaps AI technology will play an important role in revitalizing democracy from its current malaise. It might liberate citizens from the drudgery of work so as to enable them to participate in democratic discussion. Remember, Oscar Wilde said, the problem with democracy, it takes too many evenings. Well, if we have democracy doing a work for us, then maybe we'll have more evenings to spare. Maybe AI will improve the quality of democratic deliberation because it will provide citizens with informed, expert information tailored to their distinctive learning style. And maybe it will generate novel policy proposals for them to consider, and facilitate democratic deliberation at scale. Well, whichever scenario or combination of scenarios pans out is not preordained. Whether it's going to be a pro-democratic outcome or an anti-democratic outcome is not determined by the nature of the technology. It's determined by choices that human beings will make. And that's why a panel such as this is important, because we need to know, one, what the state of the technology is and what it's likely to become, and second, what are the values that we need to appeal to responsibly integrate this technology into democratic societies. So as the Prime Minister said, we now have a panel from 5 different continents in the world. I, as a Greek Australian, represent, as it were, Oceania. I'm going to invite our brilliant panel members each to briefly introduce themselves, beginning with Angela Lungati, please.
Thank you, John. My name is Angela Odro Lungati. I'm the Executive Director of a global technology nonprofit called Ushahidi that was born out of Kenya, and I'm also based in Nairobi in Kenya. The focus of our work has been using open source technology platforms to enable local communities to quickly gather data using the tools they already have access to, and community-generated data specifically, and then to use that community-generated data to generate insights, tackle the world's most pressing problems. So whether that is helping people who are affected directly by a crisis to get the help that they need, or empowering local communities to protect the outcomes of their democratic processes, or shedding light on human rights atrocities. Most recently, we've been looking at how to leverage artificial intelligence to help us move from talking about the data and it being collected, but into what the data actually means. How does that influence our decision making? What kind of insights are coming out of it? And I'm really excited to participate in today's conversation. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm Audrey Tang. I'm from Taiwan. 10 years ago, I was just a technologist working on open source civic technologies, social networks in the enterprise with Siri, with Apple, natural assistance technologies. But then by 2014, because of AI and social media, as John alluded to, Taiwan was very polarized and the trust level became just 9% at that time. So 24 million people, 20 million people were automatically against the president, whatever the president says back at the time. So I helped to broadcast the protesters' demand for 3 weeks when we peacefully occupied the parliament, and then we turned those broadcasting tools into broad listening tools, so that after 3 weeks we ended up with a plan that the head speaker simply say, okay, the people have a better idea, let's ratify that plan. And so I joined the cabinet as an advisor at the time, and then after 2 years became the digital minister in charge of social innovation, youth engagement, and open government. I served for 7.5 years, and now last May I became the cyber ambassador of Taiwan. So really happy to join you here.
Brilliant. Brendan.
Thank you. I'm Brendan McCord. I'm a technology entrepreneur based in Austin, Texas. And I have, in the private sector, founded and sold multiple AI companies. I've led AI efforts at very large businesses as well. And in the public sector, was the principal founder of the first applied AI organization for the U.S. Department of Defense. I am founder and chair of Cosmos Institute, which is a nonprofit organization, the goal of which is to try to develop a new kind of technologists, one that we call a philosopher builder. So an individual that can contemplate deeply on the alternate ends of technology, think about what human flourishing entails, but then has the skills to translate that into the planetary scale systems that are shaping our future. One of our biggest initial efforts is a partnership with Oxford to set up Oxford's newest AI lab, the Human-Centered AI Lab, within the Institute for Ethics and AI. So thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Caroline.
Hi everyone, my name is Caroline Green. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Ethics and AI at the University of Oxford. I'm leading a new £8 million program over the next 4 years called the Accelerator Fellowship Program, where we are bringing in leading and emerging thinkers in AI into the Institute to work with us on really urgent ethical topics relating to AI. But I'm also a researcher. I'm a human rights lawyer by background. I specialize on AI and aging, particularly in health and social care. And I'm actually also a downstream developer, developing an AI tool for family caregivers to support them in their caregiving role.
Thank you so much. So we're going to discuss 6 main questions, really, and have a general discussion here, and then we're going to open up to Q&A in about an hour or so's time. So the first question is a kind of provocation, and that is from a recent book by the late Henry Kissinger and also by Craig Mundy and Eric Schmidt. The book is called Genesis, Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. And they refer there to an ancient dream of the Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi and others, that maybe the ideal form of government is a king and a philosopher. But the problem with that is lack of information. How do you know what's needed if you're just 2 individuals? And they say, well, maybe we could have this kind of government where we replace the philosopher with an AI system. So the quotation I'm going to give you is, if a single mind could be engineered to represent the collective intelligence and values of a democratic polity, one immense philosopher to stand alongside the elected king, then the dual-headed philosopher and king government vision of Al-Farabi and Strauss, 20th century philosopher, could be realized. So, I talked about the malaise of democracy. Is it possible that AI could help revitalize the democracy, not through individuals voting, but by a system that is able to detect the preferences of all individuals, aggregate them, and constantly feed them into decision-making processes? Angela, are you provoked?
Very provoked. And I'm going to channel something that you said in your opening statement, that we are autonomous, rational beings with a right to have a say. One of the philosophies that we've kind of used as we build our technology at Ushahidi is a recognition of the fact that it is not just about the technology. The tech is a means to an end. It is not the tech, it is not AI in itself that is revolutionary. It is how it is used that is revolutionary. So when I saw that particular statement about replacing our agency and choice in who we want to govern us, it took me back to that thought. I personally do not believe that AI is here to replace us. I believe it's here to augment what is already existing. It is something that will be additional to all the interventions and the way we live and the way we think. It's something that will be additive rather than trying to replace us. So I'm still very much a proponent of it being a means to an end. I think it might help us deal with some of the challenges we face today, maybe detecting misinformation quickly, or helping us to really understand what it means to be democratic societies, or helping us to make more informed choices, but not making that choice for us.
I'm going to play devil's advocate since Henry Kissinger can't join us, and I'm going to suggest the following. This is treating AI as a means, as a means to an end. A lot of people are disappointed with democracy now. Why? Because they feel that the representatives that they elect do not represent them. They don't actually implement the things that they hoped would be implemented. Now, what's being suggested here is you actually have a system that is sensitive to preferences that people have. And instead of asking them to come to the polling booth repeatedly, it's able to detect these preferences and then feed them into decision-making. Why isn't that a useful tool?
So I think, first I'll say that there's kind of an unintended irony in the question, because Strauss's project was precisely to guard against this kind of utopian fantasy and to remind us of the limits that we have for perfect political wisdom or perfect justice. But on the point about representation and deliberation, I think James Madison in The Federalist focuses us on a central question, which is, do we want government to merely mirror the immediate will of the people, or do we want a refining and enlarging of the views of the people through deliberation, through representation? When citizens go down to a town hall, when they work on local issues, they're not merely expressing previously formed preferences. That's an active formation of preference that occurs at that moment. And so viewing democracy as a technique to be optimized is a dangerous kind of rationalism that potentially bypasses this process of preference formation. The other things I think it does, just because, to provide some additional thought to react to, it flattens legitimate pluralism. And what I mean by that is that there clearly are different ways of knowing and valuing in different communities. And in the Western tradition, if you zoomed out, you'd look at the heroic life, the philosophic life, the religious one, as being examples of incommensurable views on what human flourishing means. And while you can represent plurality, like I think you can use clever ways of representing this nuance, this tension, the context. I think government requires action, action requires choice, and you flatten plurality at the moment of choice. The last thing I'll say is that it misunderstands the nature of knowledge in society. And this is, I think, the most fundamental critique of having a single directing mind. What I mean by this is a lot of the knowledge that we use to act upon is knowledge that isn't written down and, in fact, is inarticulable. Think about the way an entrepreneur spots an opportunity. Or think of the way a diplomat, like Audrey, reads the room. This is something that exists in dispersed local practice. It's tacit knowledge that can't be centralized, not because it's complicated, but because of the fact of where it arises in society in the practical sphere.
Okay, so I think one really interesting issue here is, of course, how we think of democracy. So Rousseau's understanding of democracy was you form your preferences ideally in the peace and quiet of your room without interacting with anyone else. Because if you do, they're liable to be more eloquent than you or more persuasive than you, and they'll persuade you to do something other than what you really want to do. That's one model of democracy. The one that Brendan is putting forward is a different model, which says it's not enough to formulate your preferences in private. It's part of the respect you owe to your fellow citizens to engage in dialogue with them, to give them reasons for your preferences, and to listen to their reasons. So if that aspect of exchange of reasons is important to the formation of democratic will, then the AI system won't help us. Is there anyone else who wants to come in before I move on?
Yeah,
Yes.
actually, because you asked the question, so why isn't it useful? I would say it is useful in a way that it can be. And yesterday we had some brilliant early career researchers from Harvard and Yale at Oxford talking to us about this particular issue of deliberative tools, Manon Revel and Théophile Penigot, who thought of these tools as discovery tools in addition to other tools that we have got. And why does it often around AI, it's let's replace something with AI, let's replace elections with AI. Why can't it be an extra instrument? And I would also want to challenge you're talking about autonomous rational agents. So I work with people living with dementia at early stages of living with dementia. And we have seen that these tools are incredibly powerful to also hear their voices. So I think here again, they're an instrument that are adding to our democracy. I also want to pick up on deliberative democracy, the point that you just made. It's about people coming together. I'm a true believer in us coming together as humans and a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. We know that humans need that for their human flourishing. And I think that with these type of tools, we need to make sure that that is something that's still built in, or we don't lose that, that people can still come together and really learn, interact with each other as humans.
So this is an interesting point, I think, about who is within the bounds of the democratic citizenry. And you're making the point that perhaps some people whose voices aren't heard now, there might be some way to articulate their voices through the use of AI. I think some of your colleagues even talked about giving animals a potential voice in
the more than human voices.
Right.
In this world, we take care of fellow humans and also more than human systems, including animals and river systems, forest systems, and so on. And so in a very early on, like more than a decade ago, when people are imagining these AI agents, there's already this school of thought called coherent extrapolate volition, or CEV, that just extrapolates individual preferences, maximize it exactly the way that Kissinger was describing in the Genesis book. But there was already very robust conversations in the AI research community that shows actually this way we lose the mutual trust. It's like going to a gym, instead of exercising our civic muscles, you assign robots doing that exercise for you, and you clap. The robot may gain some muscles, but you don't, right? And so it's this mutual care, it is mutual taking care of human and more than human systems that builds a polity together. And so to delegate that to robots is to give up on polities. And so the competing school of thought back then was called coherent blending volition, is the human blending our preferences together so that we change our mind and change each other's mind, and in that build a polity together.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to move on to another question. I did in my introduction talk about, people have a worry about AI as an existential threat to the humanity. They also have a worry about AI as a threat to democracy. So to what extent should we give credence to the thought that AI threatens democracy? And in particular, I'd ask, which specific way do you think is the most serious way in which AI threatens democracy? I'm really looking for one way. I know it's difficult to choose one amongst others, but Brendan, do you have a particular thing that keeps you up at night about how AI might negatively impact democracy?
I think the threat to democracy comes from within democracy, and then AI radicalizes it. So Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the primary theorists on democracy, especially democracy in America, wrote of soft despotism. And this is a comprehensive but gentle power that erodes our autonomy. It erodes our capacity for self-directed action. And it does so through convenience, not through coercion. So think of it as a tendency in democracy toward gentle submission. And AI is perfect technological expression for this tendency. AI offers a kind of comfort and a passivity that we as humans crave. When I say that, think about offloading. Think about cognitive offloading. We only have so much glucose to go around, and our brain runs on glucose, and so thinking is hard. When you got up this morning and you jammed a toothbrush into your mouth, it wasn't because you had deliberated on dental hygiene. You had offloaded that to habit. You offload lots of other stuff to tools, to culture, to institutions, to political parties. And some of that is very good. You could measure civilizational progress, in the words of Alfred North Whitehead, by the number of important operations of thought you can do without thinking about them. So we have to offload to grow civilization. But on the other hand, we know from history that offloading too much is how you get normal people as concentration camp guards, people who have offloaded moral deliberation. So why do I think this is especially severe with AI? Why do I name this the number one threat? Well, I think AI entices and enables offloading at an unprecedented scale. I think that it stands to habituate us and prepare the ground for soft despotism. It stands to relieve us of the pain of thinking and the burden of living, to channel Tocqueville. And so I say that while the 20th century's greatest threat was hard despotism, it was the boot stamping the human face, I think the 21st is a milder kind. And if we lose our capacity for self-directed action, we risk becoming non-player characters in our own life. We also lose the capacity for self-government, because democracy is more about rights. It's more than rights, more than procedure. It's also about this capacity for self-direction.
So the risk of excessive delegation of distinctively human activities to these automated systems. Any other thoughts on that, or Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things and points that keep me up at night, such as misinformation. But I'm also concerned about that growing power of of the big corporates and their role in our societies, in the way that policy is being shaped. But they're not subject to the same type of accountability, democratic accountability, as governments. And that really worries me. And and this is something I'm wondering about, and how can we bring in that democratic accountability more and reshift that power onto us as people and citizens.
Actually, this is a continuation in some ways of Brendan's point, because Brendan is talking about, as it were, individuals delegating to AI systems activities that maybe ideally individuals should carry out. You're talking about governments delegating to tech corporations governmental functions that they should be taking on or regulating, but now they're being taken on by, say, a corporation that creates a risk assessment tool that is used to determine whether someone gets bail. But at the same time, it says, sorry, we can't reveal the code because of our intellectual property rights. But surely the basis on which someone is denied bail or given bail should be transparent. So I think this is really quite an important point, and it raises a very serious issue, which is whether the new technologies have enabled, as Marietta Schaak in her book, The Tech Coup says, a kind of de facto shift in authority away from governments to corporations. In the UK, we recently had a minister who said, we have to treat corporations, tech corporations, with respect. We have to treat them as though they are also comparable to sovereign states. Well, that in itself epitomizes this massive shift. So you might think, one, is this shift desirable? And second, whether it's desirable or not, if it's happened, shouldn't there be greater restrictions on these corporations that they're subject to the sorts of constraints that governments were subject to? Audrey, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I worry about strip mining our social fabric so that common ground becomes impossible. More than 10 years ago, when I was working on social networks in enterprise settings, the key performance indexes we have for our AI systems was connections made, knowledge discovered, so on and so forth. But around the same time, around 10 years ago, including YouTube and Twitter and many other places, switched to have the KPI becoming the time you spend on the platform. And then it changes the algorithm such that instead of showing people the common things that are trending in your community that are rated 5 stars or whatever, it became a very individualized algorithm, just keeps people addicted to very different feeds for each and every person. And yes, the autoplay, the short videos and everything did increase retention, engagement, but it's not human-to-human engagement. In that place, only the advertisers know which cohort, which groups we belong to, but it's taking that as input, strip mining it, and leaving the society with a bunch of individuals that think that nobody else can agree on these very factual metas. And so this strip mining of social fabric is not a future threat. It's something that already happens in the past decade, including the anxious generation. There's many studies about this, and so this is something that I'm very worried and working to correct.
Thank you. And to contribute to this negative image, do you have any worries that you want to mention?
Yeah, I mean, because the fabric of our work is really focused on data and information integrity, my answer was going to be misinformation. But then after Brendan talked about that cognitive delegation, I'm realizing that the reason why misinformation is a challenge is because there's an erosion in our capacity to make better informed choices. Right, we're being influenced by the algorithms and the things, well, the intentional injection of falsehoods. And because we've delegated that cognitive authority to these systems tell us what's true and what isn't, then we don't have the capacity to identify what is true and what isn't, and that ends up influencing the outcomes of our elections. So my answer is his.
I'd want to sort of push back slightly against that, because there's no question that there's a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation online. But as an academic, I'm duty-bound at some point to say more research is required. So I think more research is required as to what influence this has on anyone's judgments. I mean, there are academics like Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday, which is, it's actually very difficult to change people's views and to change their values. And one way I would put it would be like this. A lot of people say, look at this populist politician. They constantly tell lies, and their followers follow those lies and vote for this person. But I'd want to say in response, almost inevitably, that person's lies have been exposed without their popularity declining. And that suggests to me that there's something else going on. And that might be a difference in values. And the thing that worries me sometimes is we might be too ready to move to the assumption that the person who voted differently from us is less informed than we are, as opposed to they have different values, different priorities, because they have different experiences in life. And this, I think, threatens our democratic ethos if we make this move without evidence, if we make this move presumptively, that anyone who disagrees with the way I vote hasn't got different values, as you were saying, but they simply didn't go to university. They're uneducated and therefore don't understand their own interests. So that would be my caution. More research is needed. So anyone who's able to fund this research, talk to me later, okay? Let me move on to the third question, which is now as we've passed the halfway mark, we must become more optimistic. So, Audrey, is there some way that we can use AI not to undermine democracy, but to revitalize it? And in particular, maybe to give people who feel that their voice isn't being heard. And there's a lot of evidence that, for example, a huge chunk of the American electorate's voice is effectively not heard unless they happen to align with the interests of elites. Is there some way to give people greater voice, greater agency by deploying AI tools? Tell us about your experience.
Yes. So I mentioned in 2014, the trust level to our democratic government was at 9%. And by deploying what I call pro-social media, the social networks that surfaces this uncommon common ground from people who usually disagree with each other to find this unlikely common ground, by 2020, we're back at more than 73% of approval and trust level. And the idea here is really very simple. We make sure that the younger people, like 14 years old, 15 years old, and so on, instead of teaching them media literacy, which was in our old curriculum, is about critical thinking, consuming information, we switched that to media competence. Literacy is when you consume, competence is when you co-produce. And so it is not the individually fact-checked facts that inoculates a young mind, we discovered. It is the act of going through deliberation, through collaborative fact-checking, that teaches the young mind to think like a journalist and therefore immune to the polarization attacks, the narrative attacks, and so on. And then these young people then became the facilitators. They're not just a nonviolent facilitator during the Sunflower Movement, during the nonviolent Occupy, but we also made sure that if anyone start an online petition with 5,000 people joining, these young people then facilitate this nationwide conversation about how to find the unlikely common ground that solves this issue. For example, in 2015, around when Uber entered Taiwan with taxi, then we designed this online platform using open source AI tools so that anyone can say, I feel this way, I feel that way, but there's no reply button, so no room for trolls to grow. But people can upvote or downvote on each other's sentiments, and very quickly a shared narrative became possible. Everybody wants surge pricing, but not undercutting existing meters. Everybody wants insurance, registration, and so on, and that became law. So the idea is that the young people design a platform for the whole society to have a deliberation, and we just consistently keep applying this to hundreds and hundreds of e-petitions and so on, so that by 2020, people do trust this continuous democracy, this listening at scale actually works.
So that's interesting. Rather than promoting polarization, AI identifies unlikely common ground. Can you give an example of unlikely common ground that was identified?
Certainly. So by early 2020, when the COVID was taking the world by surprise, this collaborative fact-checking network with students and everybody have surfaced like two different, very polarized narratives that are gaining ground. On one side, because of the SARS experience we had before, there's people saying only N95, the highest grade masks, are useful against the virus. Everything else is damaging. The other side says, oh, actually it's ventilation, aerosol, whatever. Wearing a mask damages your health, no matter, and N95 damaged the most. And so these two have the potential to grow into the kind of polarization that I just mentioned on social media. But using this way to discover uncommon grounds, within 24 hours, we pushed out this very cute meme, with a cute dog, a Shiba Inu, the Dodge dog, and with her paw on her mouth saying, wear a mask to remind each other to keep your dirty, unwashed hands from your face. So it changes. Because at that time, more research is needed on the mask interaction with the virus, but no research is needed if you just use it as a way to remind people to wash their hands.
Yes.
And so everybody who have seen this meme, it's called humor over rumor, and loved about it, then become depolarized. They cannot get angry anymore from those two polarized narrative attacks. And so we de-escalated that in the beginning of the pandemic. We applied very similar ways, showing the availability of masks visually, the preferences of different brands of vaccines, so turning vax, anti-vax into my brand is better than your brand. I got all 4 brands just to make a point, and so on. And so the point here is to see the conflicts in the society, not seeing them as fire to be put out, but put them into this engine that produces uncommon ground so that we can harness this conflict into co-creation.
Amazing. Caroline.
I want to add to that because I was talking to a group of 18 to 25-year-olds the other day, and they had just used a deliberative AI tool for their school, actually. And what they said to me was that it was so much fun. And it put fun back into democracy. That's what they said to me. And I think often, maybe this is quite an obvious point, but actually there can be barriers to, for example, going to vote, because you haven't been able to register your address or so. And they said this is something we can do here together, and it's a lot of fun for us. And another thing they said is there were some people there who were neurodivergent. They need information in different ways. They look at videos rather than text and so on. And that tool was able to provide that. So I thought that was really upbeat.
But there are preconditions to this. So presumably there are preconditions in Taiwan that enabled this to be successful. Mm-hmm. So one of them would be a fairly digitally literate society.
Broadband as a human right, like everywhere it has.
So what are the preconditions?
4G and 5G.
What are the key preconditions for this to actually be a possibility?
The other precondition is a pre-commitment to basically whenever an uncommon ground is surfaced, a minister cannot pretend that it didn't happen. We have to at least provide a reasoned articulation as if it is the Speaker of the Parliament during an interpellation on why that may not be that possible because of laws of physics. But other than that, we pre-commit to consider them as seriously as the leading legislator's proposal. Without this pre-commitment, it is like open washing. People would contribute a lot and then just finding, oh, it's being sidelined. So pre-commitment and broadband as a human right, I think these two are equally important.
Excellent. I'm going to move on to the 4th issue, because now we talked about democratizing the normal functioning of government, your Polis platform generating this deliberation, articulating certain strands of consensus, feeding them into actual legislation. But democracy doesn't just happen in formal legislation. We can talk about a democratic culture more generally. And one of the things I want to come back to is, Caroline, one of your main fears was increasingly power is shifting from democratic governments to corporations. Should we democratize these corporations themselves, and can AI play a role in doing that?
Well, so, when I think about this, I tend to go back to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And under these principles, they recognize the main duty of the state to protect human rights, but they also recognize an independent duty to respect human rights on the side of private corporations. And I think this is really, really important. And this applies to every type of corporation, whether they're small or whether they're big. So we can think of OpenAI, but we can also think of the downstream developer that has, developed a tool that's now making bail decisions. They're all bound by all human rights equally. And thus they have this responsibility to think about it and to apply it in their work. And that's something to think about internally to their employees, for example. What is it that their employees need, what are the human rights concerns. One of the issues that comes to mind here is, for example, those poor people who have to go through content moderation on social media and are then, having to face some horrific pictures or so on. What are the human rights issues here that these people are facing? But then they also need to think about the human rights concerns and the impact they might be making onto society, onto individuals. And what is needed here is quite often here now, stakeholder engagement is one of the big buzzwords in AI. And I think this needs to be done really well. It can't just be a tick-the-box exercise. It's something where we need to find meaningful ways of engaging with different people to really manage these risks, but also identify them and then respond to them in a really meaningful way. And just going back to the UNGPs, Meta, for example, is taking them really seriously. They have built their oversight board. But that oversight board, I think, also shows some of the pitfalls, right? We've got the theory here, but then actually putting it into practice is always a bit more difficult. So with the oversight board, that's limited to content moderation and the right to free speech. Now, there are some issues around this. So first of all, why would you just limit it to free speech? If you're determined to work with human rights and along the lines of the UNGPs, then look also at the rights of your employees, for example, and what you can do there, and go beyond the right to the freedom of speech. And then we also know that they actually find it, the Meta Oversight Board actually find it increasingly difficult to work with in such a limited way. They're saying, well, in one country, you might think that a particular type of content is, not okay, but in another country it might be okay. So, there are different types of preferences. So I think we need to think about that, and it's really important to take the UNGPs as a framework forwards and to celebrate it, but to also build on it and make it better in the light of AI.
I think the case of Meta powerfully illustrates a widespread assumption that if you're talking about rights, that's an elite discourse that has to be taken outside of democratic decision-making. So what Meta did was create, in effect, its own Supreme Court, this oversight board made up of experts. And the alternative, I think you're suggesting, would have been a more democratic approach that engaged their employees, that engaged also people who use their products, and gave them some real decision-making power. And if that were the case, it's unlikely they would have focused entirely on freedom of speech as the consideration.
Absolutely, and just as an example, I'm currently hosting, my research at the moment is a cross-sector collaboration in the UK for social care, looking at defining what the responsible use of AI in health and social care means. And that's because there are a lack of guidelines at the moment, but a lot of care workers in care homes, for example, have started to use ChatGPT and the like for all sorts of different things. Now, this raises human rights issues, right? Everyone is very excited, I understand it, but it raises issues. So we're now working with the tech sector, we're working with care workers, we're working with care providers, with policymakers. We've all come together to create this shared understanding of what responsible AI means in this context, what tools are needed. And we've got now a tech providers pledge that's about to be published. We've got care providers guidelines. We've got principles to work with. And I think that's also a very democratic way of going about this topic.
OpenAI was also using the same platform you used in their program called Democratic Inputs to AI to introduce some democratic input into their corporate decisions. What happened there?
Yes. So the Collective Intelligence Project worked both with Anthropic and OpenAI in using this way of online, like deliberative and sortition-based, statistically representative sample of people. And so on the Anthropic side, this collectively created document, they call it a constitution, but really just a model specification, went into the training of the Claude 3 model. So before Claude 3, they made this very naive assumption that everybody, for example, walks on two legs or something. But using this kind of collective constitution making, and Claude 3 no longer makes that mistake. Some people are in wheelchairs and so on. So it has a bias reduction role, and it does not hamper the capacity. For OpenAI, The idea is that people who propose the most bridge-making, the uncommon grounds, get to have this face-to-face like town hall with the OpenAI people. And to Meta's credit, Meta also worked with Stanford on the Deliberative Democracy Lab, again, on the sortition in many countries and on synthetic content. And they also had like this common suggestions that Meta implements some of it. Though none of this has the pre-commitment that I just mentioned, like we will turn it into law unless it violates the laws of physics, right, or some other constitutional law. So we actually took in Taiwan Meta's idea and the platform to also talk about synthetic content, but with the additional pre-commitment that we're going to turn the consensus into law. And so people become much more interested, and 200,000 random citizens in Taiwan receive SMS invitation. And after a whole day of conversation with 450 people in 45 rooms, facilitated by an AI, they came with this very strong liability law that says if Meta runs an advertisement selling something, that someone need to digitally sign on this advertisement. Otherwise, if somebody gets scammed for 1 million, Facebook need to pay that 1 million in damage. And if they don't pay, then we get to slow down connection to Facebook, even stop resolving the Facebook domain. So that's what people came up with 85% or more agreement across party lines. And so then we just checked with Meta, was like, is this against laws of physics? Of course it's not. And so that's law. And today, the celebrity crypto scam advertisements on Facebook and YouTube is largely going in Taiwan because we're the only jurisdiction in which that this kind of law was just implemented.
Great. So it's one question whether you use AI tools to consult with people and take the temperature of their opinion, which can start looking a bit like market research, or whether you give them genuine agency with the pre-commitment that these will be implemented. And that was part of the point we began with, that deliberation in democracy is not simply about figuring out what people's preferences are. It's about a process of decision-making and agency.
Yes.
I feel constrained to let our corporate figure have a say on this topic. So, Brendan.
As an honorary corporate figure, so a lot of times when we talk about excessive corporate power, what we mean is companies that have made great products or lowered prices or delivered more convenience. In other words, have created immense value for their customers. And in the case of AI, if we project forward, what this may mean is mass education for billions or curing cancer. What it has already meant, what markets have already enabled us to do, is give people lots more leisure, give them near unlimited access to creative works, extend lifespan, on and on and on. So I wouldn't want companies to be talked about as kind of purely harmful. And in fact, they are already governed in a polycentric way by markets, for example. Their customers have quite a lot of power. Employees have quite a lot of power in terms of their mobility. Capital markets, those sorts of things are, not to mention boards and suppliers. So there's a fabric of governance that acts upon the companies, norms and standards in addition to the law. So the tendency is to kind of react to excess corporate power and say that we need to add regulation. Regulation perversely might have the consequence of enshrining the very concentration you seek to avoid. Why is that the case? Well, guess who can deal with regulation? It's companies that can pay for lawyers and accountants, not the little guy. And so the companies that can navigate it and who can, are happy to have a condition for cartel economics present, those are big companies that can do that. And I've seen that as an entrepreneur. Regarding trying to graft democratic processes or treat companies as mini parliaments, I think it confuses the spheres. I think the rule of law sets the frame in which voluntary corporate action can occur. It enforces contracts, it establishes property rights, it prevents force and fraud, it does a whole host of other things that set the playing field. And then when it comes to the kind of accountability, we have these evolved governance structures that occur within companies. And I think adding a democratic process, like trying to sort of graft it on, actually diffuses genuine accountability in an interesting way. The companies no longer are entirely responsible for their decisions. It's actually a democratic process that has resulted in that.
It's really interesting, though, the point you make about, in fact, we can't go simply from talking about corporations to free markets. In fact, it could be large corporations that have a great incentive to prevent competition, and arguably that is what's happening in the big tech sector right now. And a lot of the regulations that are in place may often be regulations written by big tech for government to protect them from further competition. So these are very complex issues, but in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to move on and think about the global situation. And Angela, this is in the first instance to you. Anu Bradford has written this brilliant book called Digital Empires, where she describes a struggle between three major empires for the control of the ideology behind digital technology and its regulation. The Chinese authoritarian model, the American market-driven model, and the rights-based model of the EU. Now, how should democracies think of themselves as operating on the international plane in order to get the global regulation they need? Because some of the challenges thrown up by AI are global in nature and require global regulation. Bradford's suggestion is we should have a coalition of techno-democracies facing off against what you might call authoritarian, techno-authoritarian societies. So there's going to be this tension. Now, she has this assumption that the US will converge towards the EU model. I think in light of the recent election in America, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But is that picture one that you would find attractive? The democracies, in a way, creating their standards as a rival to the autocracies? And what would be the role of those smaller nations, especially in the global south, who don't have a big say in AI? How will their voice be heard in this global struggle?
So I think that's a part that I struggle with, because it automatically assumes that the status quo is what will remain throughout, and that these are the only powers that be. And when we talk about some of these smaller countries, it's really from a perspective, a subservient perspective of us being consumers and just needing to have a seat at the table to kind of tick a box. And I am a very big proponent of ensuring that if you're going to give me a seat at the table, let me actually have a seat at the table, right? And that means that we have to talk about what it is that would create a level playing field. What are some of those things that are blocking the global south from actually having that seat at the table? Right? What are the challenges around access to compute, the challenges around talent, the challenges around the data gaps? And we can go into a big rabbit hole about whose responsibility it is to make sure that that happens, but we really cannot talk about democracy when you have a group of people that do not even have the agency to compete at that global level. The second thing that comes to mind is a conversation that we had with ITS Rio in Bellagio last year, which is the recognition of the diverse ways in which technology is used, right? It's not about this pluralistic perspective. Yes, there are global challenges, but then there are very nuanced ways in which technology is used. And so when we talk about AI governance and regulation, some of it, most of it has to be grounded in the lived realities of how the technology is applied in those different places, and also grounded in those values. A lot of the conversation around regulation in the African continent and how we're shaping our AI strategies is how do we embed our cultural values? How do we embed the different ways in which technology is used to then harness this power?
This is a really important point about the need to balance universality and particularity. And one of the ways lawyers think about this is in terms of the notion of subsidiarity. That you may have the same norm in place, but you adapt it in different ways in different environments. So I think Caroline gave the example of if you had democratic deliberation going into the norms that govern content moderation, why assume that it's the same free speech norm in America as in Germany? Maybe the Germans have perfectly good reasons to have a more constrained free speech norm that doesn't include hate speech, and the Americans have perfectly good reasons of their own to have a more absolutist approach to free speech. Now, of course, to the corporate sector, they prefer having the same rules applying throughout because it's convenient for them. But I think your point is a very powerful one, that people have their own cultures, their own identity, and we have to recognize that pluralism as part of the kind of global common good we're trying to foster.
Yeah, the unified bloc of techno-democracies reminds me a little bit of neoconservatism. I know that's maybe an unlikely connection, but this is something in the US that reached its zenith in the early 2000s, and it basically drew up the world into the allies of democracy and then those who were against. And among all the good guys, so to speak, there was an effort to consolidate and then impose the will through a concentration of power. And it sort of has an authoritarian impulse behind it. It has an authoritarian uniformity behind it as well. And I think it ignores one of the key insights of democracy, which is there is such varied expression of human nature. We can support so many different, rival ideas and different ways of knowing and valuing. And in fact, societies can be very strong in doing that. So the idea that all people want freedom and that there's one framework for doing it ends up being very problematic. And you look at Iraq and Afghanistan as examples there. But I think a more realistic approach is you can have nations that have bilateral relationships in which they advocate their interests and values. We can advocate for freedom, we can advocate for dynamism, so long as we understand that the way in which it takes hold will look very, very different in different places. And always remember that democracy grows kind of organically and through demonstration as opposed through imposition, even by a coalition of this sort.
Yes, I think these are important points, and one issue here is what exactly we mean by democracy. And people like Bradford and others automatically equate democracy with liberal democracy. And I think a really important question for our times is this correct? I mentioned my colleague Josh Ober, who wrote a book called Demopolis, in my view, one of the best books ever written about democracy. And he says, look, democracy historically and conceptually pre-exists liberalism. Democracies are not necessarily liberal, though they may overlap with some liberal requirements. And I think that's an important point, because the democracy in America is quite different from European democracy. The doctrine of rights that Europeans have is quite different from the doctrine of rights that Americans have. And then if we think about other countries, like India, for example, they may be democracies. Are they liberal? Do they want to be liberal? So we need to preserve the maximum amount of common ground we can find. And one way to do that is not to pack in our whole ideology into the concept of a democracy. And then, of course, there are some hopeful thinkers like the leading Chinese philosopher Ji Wei-chi, who thinks that eventually there will be great pressure on the Communist Party to embrace some form of democracy, albeit probably not liberal democracy, because liberalism isn't strongly attuned to Chinese culture. Anyone else with thoughts on this topic? So let me go. I began with a kind of provocation, and I will end with a different sort of provocation, which is we've talked about democracies within the global sphere and how they should band together or not to promote valuable global regulation. But what about a utopian dream, Audrey, of a global public sphere of deliberation where all human beings together can deliberate about matters of genuinely global concern? Can AI enable this, do you think?
Well, the current generation of generative AI has most of its grounding done in Wikipedia. Arguably, Wikipedia is one such global forum for, again, a very tiny slice of human life, the life of doing encyclopedia together. But even though that is a tiny slice, it did show that it is possible for people with profound differences in culture, in languages, and so on, to not dominate each other, but to maintain this dynamic pluralism in that anybody who disagree with any edit in Wikipedia can fork away and build their own thing, bound by the social contract that whatever they add to it need, if this original upstream want, this fork can be merged back. And so this share-alike phenomenon that we found online, this data commons or data collision, co-ops, many ways to call this, I think now serves as a model for many different areas. For example, on performance, on art, on speech, on languages, and so on, to build such commons. And the governance of such commons, I think, is one beginning of this kind of global conversations. Of course, in the matter of ethics, like the constitutional AI or the model specs or the deliberative alignment with the reasoning models today, if you check out globaldialogues.ai, then we actually now, with the Collective Intelligence Project, keep asking periodically people these very hard questions, scenarios, to surface the uncommon ground. Like people, by and large, from what we have seen, worry about over-reliance on AI bots, the care bots that takes people away from actual mutual care. On the other hand, there's this uncommon ground that when caring for really aging people, especially people with cognitive impairments, sometimes it's okay. In some parts of the world, they kind of swing this way. And how do we challenge that? How do we start ethical conversation? I think these values and pluralistic alignment, as the technical term, I think is a much better starting point than just the laws. Even though that I talk about crowd law like all night, I think the values and the values, meta values, the things that I prefer, that others prefer, I think that is a good starting point also for this global dialogue.
Absolutely. Anyone want to add to this? Yes.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think a global dialogue can happen. I think actual global democracy implies some institutional enforcement, and it implies a world state. And that seems to me to be a very disturbing path. AI makes conceivable a world state for the first time plausibly, because it can enable these global dialogues and because it can enable planetary action. So we have to think about this, and if we think about any state that is powerful enough to implement the democratically arrived at decisions, that state has to have the power to override local resistance, which could come from many reasons: cultural, economic, lots of other things. And so it faces a choice. Does it accept a kind of defiance and then lose its authority? Or does it allow for, or does it rather force compliance and then lose the pretense of democracy? So I think a state like this would start out with a very nice, like, nudging-based model that feels very nice to try to get people to do what they want. But when faced with really the challenge of people not agreeing, then they would have to choose between a kind of impotence or a tyranny, and they could choose the latter.
This is the kind of Kantian position about a global state, but I don't think you were necessarily implying there'd be a global state. So, because back to the point about subsidiarity, you'd have to figure out which were the questions to be determined at which level, and maybe the questions that were going to be determined at the global level are more minimal. There are more issues around human survival, like, for example, let's not use AI in launching of nuclear weapons, versus other questions, like exactly the content of the free speech norm, that will be determined at a much lower level. So it would be multiple layers, I guess, of governance, each operating within their own appropriate sphere.
Exactly.
Though keeping people in their own appropriate sphere, of course, is always a problem. Anyone else with a thought before I turn over to the audience for some questions? No? Okay, so I'm going to take some questions now. Maybe I can see some hands, and maybe if we could take 3 questions. And just a reminder, questions usually one sentence with the question mark at the end, fairly brief. So let's begin here.
Okay, thank you. I have a question regarding separation of societies. I see, as of today, people or performers or high performers getting even better, but I don't see low performers getting better. So
Low-performing society.
yeah. So how do you see this? Does this scissors comes together in the future? Like, my mother is a power user of an iPhone today. She wasn't 2012 a power user, or do we see this separation of societies and using AI, and the ones make them even more powerful, and we see a lot of Iron Man in the society, and then some poor guys not
Great.
using it.
Excellent. Question behind you, pass the mic.
Hello, my name is Amir Rushiti. Here we all know that the AI is all about getting computer to act without explicitly programmed. And nowadays we know that we have a lot of things going on, because there are a lot of questions feeding their algorithms, which means that this is becoming increasingly more and more a risk when it comes to the sustainability, because we have on another hand also the AI, in another hand we have also the autonomous vehicles and all those stuff which are increasingly needed for the energy. And my question is related to the sustainability when it comes with AI and all those new things which are coming with autonomous vehicles.
Question. And there was a third question behind you. So very helpful. That's excellent.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the insightful panel. And I'm going to direct a question which is bringing the discussion down to the reality, down to emerging democracies like Kosova. So I'd like to ask one of you in the panel, how can we ensure AI innovation, open source technologies, or even emerging technologies, including not only quantum or AI, create actually or benefit democracies, emerging democracies like Kosovo, in creating, let's say, equitable access to opportunities, which is something that we really want, while mitigating, if not avoiding, those safety concerns or unintended consequences. Thank you.
Great. So there are three really good questions. One question is about how do we avoid increasing growth in the gap between high-performing, lower-performing countries with respect to AI. Related to that, how do we help emerging democracies become higher performing and integrate AI into their technology, into their societies? And finally, very important question, AI has a very significant environmental footprint. So what are the implications and the trade-offs for sustainability? Would you like to begin?
Yeah, I think the steerability of AI is, to me, top of my mind. While a democracy, if they notice harm, can always detect harm and just hit the brake, or if they see an opportunity for development and hit the pedal, if the harms are detected before it became too bad, then actually it enables democracy to build that civic muscles to steer harms away, right? So I use the example of like Uber, social media, the online fraud and things like that. All of this, before they became like truly bad problems, actually let the people exercise their civic muscle and steer things away. And I think that's how emerging democracies, because we have less of a legacy way of doing things, can try this kind of fast detection and fast steering, and therefore use AI in a way that is pro-social instead of anti-social. So that addresses the emerging technology question.
You're in a sense saying that emerging democracies can take more risks than more authoritarian systems because they have a system in place to be responsive to the dangers that arise?
And also we have less hard-coded norms in how to do this kind of threat detection and steering.
Great. Other thoughts on these questions, Angela?
Yeah, I want to tackle the one around the separation of societies. I think we have a choice to make at this moment. We can decide whether we want to see that separation to continue, or if there are things that we're going to do differently. And as someone who comes from one of those societies that tends to be associated with that lack of progress, I can tell you for a fact that the ecosystem of people who are working within that space are very aware of the challenges that we are facing and are trying to think about the different ways to address it. I know that one of the biggest challenges tends to be that we think that innovation will follow the rational path, that you have to go through step 1 and 2 to get to step 3. When you look at the 4th industrial revolution, right, we saw a lot of emerging markets leapfrog, right? This is where things like mobile money came about, because we thought about things in a very different way, in ways that were very nuanced or contextualized. Now with AI, I'm not saying that it'll have to be the same, just because there are certain steps that, certain things that we have to take into account. The risks are much higher, but I think there's a lot more thought that can definitely go into how to solve these problems, as long as it is grounded in what our lived realities are in that moment.
And I just want to respond quickly to the sustainability point. So training a large language model, I think, emits as much carbon as 2 large cars in the course of their whole lifetime. So there is a significant impact there on the environment. And I think that leads to 2 questions. Why are we developing AI? For what particular purpose? For antisocial purposes, to suck up people's attention and sell them consumer products they don't really need? Or for valuable purposes? I think we really need to ask that question. What role did AI play during the pandemic? Did it help people avoid being in risky situations where they had to deliver things? Or did it not play such a role? I think you'll find it didn't play much of a positive role. So it really forces us to say, the idea of creating artificial general intelligence is not in itself valuable. What's valuable is creating tools that further human purposes, because they do involve a cost. They're not cost-free. And there's also other ways we can be using the billions of dollars that are put into AI development. And the second point I guess I'd make is AI could be a tool for addressing issues around climate change. So it's all about pro-social uses of AI, but I think that will only come from more robust democratic control of AI. This side of the room surely must have questions.
Brendan has a point. John?
Okay, there's one question there. Can we get two more? And the second question there, okay, and then I'm hoping for another one afterwards. Okay, you want to go first?
Thank you. It's been really interesting to hear about all these different ways that AI can aggregate and distill the views of a variety of different people. Just wondered, do you worry about bias in the algorithms? And how do you guard against, how do you identify that? How are you sure that you're getting truth out of this?
And in front of you.
Thank you. In the past, we've seen in every revolution, be it industrial, the printing, everything, people suffered during the revolution. And also now people are suffering. For example, entry-level positions, also in my company, we need less of them. I want to hear some thoughts, what makes you optimistic, how we all benefit in the midterm. Because now there's quite some disruption and many people are suffering.
Great. So how do we avoid bias in the algorithms that aggregate different people's views? And even if in the long term AI is going to be beneficial, there's more immediate term disruption.
Yeah, so I would like to respond to the first question. So I'm also, human rights of older people is my area of work, and ageism is a real issue here. And it's an issue that people are aware of, but not really as much as we should be. And we do see a lot of ageism, ageist bias in outputs. So that is a real problem. And first of all, we actually need the social awareness of it, and we need to want to do something about it. And Joy Bulawini, for example, is a researcher at MIT in the US who has written a book on unmasking AI, and she found racial bias. So there's some work going into that, but I would say that there's a lot more needed in terms of also different types of bias.
But in terms of your systems,
yes,
because it was kind of directed to you, I think, that question.
Okay, yes. So the system Polis, right, that we used. So initially, Polis does not use any generative AI. So when we deploy it, actually up until a year ago, it had no generative AI components. So it's just k-means clustering, principal component analysis. These things are very explainable. And then we have like data journalists writing those narrative reports, grounding them in the individual statements, and so on. Now, of course, data journalists and the students who are trained to be facilitators can also be biased. There's no zero bias human, but at least there's a way to kind of peer check that. Now, as of this year, the generative AI's grounding capabilities now becomes good enough so that the latest version of Polis on GitHub, on this open source collaboration platform, now actually can play the function of data journalist, but it has the same ethos of bridging, of balancing, and so on. And actual journalism, PhDs, I believe, check the groundedness so that it is actually held to account. And now we're experimenting with this idea of community alignment. So when a community expects a different style of reporting, a different style of journalism, they do not have to take the stock data journalist, even though that is now grounded at above 98%. They don't have to believe that. They can tune their own data journalism to provide this narrative report. And I think it really needs to close the loop. So for a few conversations to be narrated by that community-tuned model, as well as the community data journalists for a while, and then spot checking and so on. So we're not rolling it out in a top-down way, but rather as open source sense-making tools that everybody can work in conjunction with their existing narrative reporting.
This is bias mitigation. There's no way you can eliminate it entirely.
Yes, but people can be very transparent about their community's biases.
John? Yeah, just on the point of truth-seeking and bias, I think AI systems are good at delivering answers today, and that's the way I think of them as as answer machines or oracles. They deliver those. And when you're asking a question like what's 10 factorial or something, you do want an answer. But when you're asking the kinds of questions that matter in democracy, questions about justice or economic policy or what should I do, you don't want an answer. like that. You certainly don't want an answer that's a kind of averaging, even if it's an averaging that tries its best to zap the bias. You certainly don't want something that's approved by a kind of ministry of truth, like some centralized answer for this is what that is. And so what do you want? Well, I think you want access to diverse and competing views. You want to be able to, this is kind of a million idea about how truth works, is that you want to be able to subject your opinions to lots of different competing views, ideally to move away from falsity and towards truth. You also want to understand the questions that surround a central question. So as an example, if I'm trying to think about how do I balance open innovation with risk or sustainability or things like that, this brings up a kind of complex of questions. Philosopher Philip Corliss calls it an inquiry complex. And we should be able to use AI to surface some of those questions, things that we need to grapple with to have a view on the central question. But I think the question of bias needs to be flipped around and start looking a bit more at like structured inquiry. And then truth-seeking needs to be thought of more as a process than as a centralized fact-checker model where we try to cleave facts and say that this is truth.
I think the point you're making about AI not necessarily just being something that delivers answers is very important. I've been working with Yejin Choi, who's a leading AI scientist, and she produced an AI system called Delphi, which would answer your moral questions, like give a yes-no answer to what you should do. And I suggested that maybe a better thing to do would be, rather than answer what should I do, talk about the constellation of values that are in play in addressing this question. So it highlights issues of rights, for example, or issues of fairness, or issues of charity. So we produced this alternative called Kaleido, which instead of answering, actually gives you food for deliberation. Not food in the sense of necessarily what people's views are, but as it were, a view about what the array of value considerations are that are at play. So I think we need to be more imaginative about how we use AI. And it's not always going to be someone that takes my decisions for me, but someone enhancing the quality of my decision by bringing out the salient concerns. Now, there was one question we've neglected to answer, which is the unfortunate people who bear the brunt of initial AI developments. How can we protect them? Does anyone have any thoughts?
I'm going to try. So I think one, we need to recognize and acknowledge that change is always hard, right? But the reason I am optimistic is because, again, going back to the fourth industrial revolution, when computers were introduced, everyone was fearful about them replacing them, right? But the people who adapted and figured out how to leverage it in their own ways were able to move forward. And we're now, we're seeing the benefits of it. There's so many jobs that have been created. So I think we're going to have to have an adaptive mindset. So for those lower entry jobs, yes, it is a hard situation right now. But then how do you look at that as an opportunity? What else can you do with AI, right? For the designers out there, how can I use AI to make better things than what I've been creating before? How can it enhance my creativity? So I look at that as an opportunity rather than a thing to be worried about. People are always afraid of the unknown, but I think we need to embrace it and then explore and open up our minds to what the possibilities could be.
And I think that the hopeful attitude you're encouraging is a lot more possible if you live in a society with the protections of a democracy than anywhere else. Caroline, I have a sense you want to conclude with a thought that we can all take away and ruminate on. So let us know.
Pressure. No. Just to that question, I see that in the area of social isolation, where there's now sort of a lot of excitement that we can use chatbots to address the really big social problems of social isolation and loneliness. But I think one of the big problems is that we mustn't see AI as a panacea to some of these really big problems. Policymakers still need to look, and us as a society, we need to look at what other ways are there that we need to implement in order to address social isolation, for example. And that's creating more community spaces, for example, to make sure that people have time to come together and have meaningful human encounters instead of just putting chatbots in there. So I think maybe not to be too overexcited about what AI can do for us and not see it as something that will replace other ways of encountering each other.
Thank you. I think we need to draw to an end there. So can I end by thanking everyone for your attendance, for your excellent questions, and can I ask you to thank this panel for this excellent discussion? Thank you, guys.
Great.
That was fantastic. Thank you.